Imagine walking into a home and realizing the walls themselves were hiding death. Imagine a killer who thought he could collect human lives like trophies until one mistake exposed everything. This is a story of how a man's secret collection of bodies was uncovered, turning quiet suspicion into a nightmare the world would never forget. But before we can understand how police made that discovery, we need to go back. It began like all great horrors do, quietly. A neighborhood where children rode bicycles, where neighbors waved to each other from across driveways, where backyard barbecues carried the smell of normalcy. But behind closed doors, one man was building something darker, something unspeakable. To the outside world, he was just another face, someone you might pass in a grocery aisle and never remember. But hidden away inside his home, he had a secret life, a second existence. And every day he fed it one victim at a time. Neighbors noticed things, strange smells in the summer heat, curtains that never moved, trash that was taken out at odd hours of the night. But suspicion only goes so far when there's no proof. People gossiped. They shrugged it off. Because how could anyone imagine what was really going on inside? For years, families searched for loved ones who had vanished without explanation. Their faces appeared on posters, on the nightly news, in the fading hope of candlelight vigils. And yet, their stories went unanswered. Unanswered, because the answers were hidden just a few doors away. Outwardly, the man lived a life designed not to attract attention. He paid his bills. He waved when he had to. He blended in. But behind that mask, his obsession grew. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about power, control, possession. Each life he took wasn't just stolen. It was added to his collection. Because this wasn't simply about killing. This was about keeping, preserving, like artifacts locked away in a museum that no one was ever supposed to see. Only, this museum reeked of death. For years, he was invisible, a ghost in plain sight. But like all killers, he made a mistake. It started small, a slip of routine, a detail overlooked, a piece of evidence that, on its own, seemed meaningless. But in the hands of investigators, those tiny cracks began to spread, and soon, suspicion hardened into certainty. Detectives followed the trail, right to his doorstep. They expected a man with secrets. What they found instead was a house of horrors, visual prompts. But before the police ever stepped foot inside that house, before they found the trophies, the bags, the evidence that would shock the nation, we have to understand how it all began. Because no one becomes a monster overnight. To understand the night the house gave up its secrets, we need to go back to the very beginning, where this story truly starts. Monsters are not born, they are made. Every twisted compulsion, every dark obsession, every secret craving has roots. And for this man, those roots grew in silence, in shadows, in the very places where no one was paying attention. He was not born into violence. At least, not in the way most people expect. There was no headline-making tragedy at first, no flashing warning signs. To teachers, he was just another child. To neighbors, just another face in the crowd. But inside the home, it was different. There were arguments that rattled the walls. A father who seemed distant. A mother who alternated between suffocating affection and cold silence. And for a boy desperate for stability, that kind of love felt more like abandonment. He never quite fit in. Classmates remembered him as quiet, awkward, often isolated. He would sit alone at lunch, sketching shapes that no one else understood. It wasn't just shyness. It was something else. The kind of disconnection that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. And over time, that isolation grew into resentment. He wasn't just alone. He was invisible. And soon, invisibility became fuel for darker fantasies. It started with small things. An unusual obsession with insects, pinning them, dissecting them, keeping them. Neighbors saw him wandering alone in wooded areas, carrying jars, collecting things that didn't need collecting. And then came animals, missing pets, stray cats that never returned. No one suspected him, of course. After all, he was just a quiet boy down the street. But in hindsight, these were the earliest experiments. early rehearsals for what was to come. As he grew older, the cracks at home widened. His father eventually left, walking out without explanation. His mother, distracted, overwhelmed, grew colder still. The boy was left to raise himself. No structure, no guidance, no warmth. This is where obsession thrives. In the absence of control, a child seeks it in other ways, and he found his control in death. By the time he reached his teenage years, something had shifted. On the outside, he was learning how to wear a mask. He could mimic small talk. He could smile when expected. But on the inside, his fantasies had grown. He began to imagine entire scenarios, control over others, power over life and death. This wasn't a passing phase. It was practice. Practice for the man he was becoming. Teachers noticed his writings. Disturbing, violent, obsessive. But in a crowded school system, troubled boys often slipped through the cracks. And that's exactly what he did. Each disturbing essay, each drawing that should have raised alarms, became just another piece of paper lost in a stack. The warnings were there. They were ignored. And with each missed chance to intervene, the path grew darker. There comes a moment in every killer's life when fantasy is no longer enough. For him, it came late in his teens. The thrill of imagining wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more. He needed to make it real. And so he planned. He rehearsed. He chose his moment. And when it finally came, it was a choice no one would ever forget. What happened next would shatter the illusion of the quiet boy next door. It would mark the beginning of a pattern that would haunt investigators for decades. Because once he crossed that line, there was no going back. And soon, the world would meet its newest monster. He had been waiting for this moment for years. The fantasies weren't enough anymore. He needed reality. And like all predators, he began with something small. Something that allowed him to test control. To feel the rush of power that came with deciding whether another life would continue or end. The first time, it wasn't even about the victim. It was about him. Predators don't just attack. They study. They plan. They stalk. And that's exactly what he did. He began following people. Strangers. Classmates. Even neighbors. At first, it was just watching. But then, he started following them home. Walking steps behind them in the dark. Breathing in their fear. Even when they didn't know he was there. The power of it intoxicated him. It was only a matter of time before watching was enough. They say your first time defines everything. For him, it was clumsy, messy, impulsive. One night, while following a young woman home, something in him snapped. The fantasy turned into reality with terrifying speed. A struggle in the dark, a hand over a mouth, the sound of muffled screams swallowed by the night air. When it was over, she was still. Silent, gone, and he, shaking, panting, covered in the proof of what he had done, felt something powerful. Relief, pleasure, control. The silence was addictive. Most killers panic after their first murder. They fear getting caught. They hide. They retreat. But not him. Instead, he studied it. He replayed the moment in his head like a film on a loop. Every detail, every sound, every feeling. And soon, the panic transformed into something else. An obsession to do it again, but better. Cleaner. Smarter. More controlled. The first kill hadn't satisfied him. It had only awakened him. He told himself it was a one-time thing. But the craving returned faster than he expected. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And then one night, he couldn't stop himself. The second victim came easier. The third smoother. Each time, he learned something new. How to move faster, how to hide better, how to erase traces. By the time anyone realized people were disappearing, he had already perfected his craft. At first, no one connected the disappearances. One young woman gone. Then another. Then someone else. Different neighborhoods. Different lives. No clear link. But detectives began to whisper. Something wasn't right. They didn't know it yet, but they were already chasing a ghost. While police searched for answers, he blended in. To neighbors, he was polite, quiet, helpful. At work, He showed up on time. At church, he nodded in the pews. No one saw the monster hiding underneath. And this is what made him so dangerous. He wasn't a shadow in the night anymore. He was the man standing right beside you. Every killer slips. And for him, it came during what should have been a perfect crime. A witness. Just one person who saw something strange that night. A car parked where it shouldn't have been. A man walking where no one usually walked. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, police had a thread. A single thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. And while investigators quietly began connecting dots, he was already moving on. The bodies were piling up, and soon, hiding them became a problem he needed to solve. But his solution would reveal something far darker than anyone could imagine, because for him, killing wasn't enough anymore. Now he wanted to keep them. For most killers, the body is a problem to be solved, something to bury, to burn, to erase. But for him, the bodies became something else. After his first few killings, he stared down at the lifeless forms and felt something strange. Not panic, not fear, but attachment. He didn't want to get rid of them. He wanted to keep them. The first time he kept one, it wasn't planned. The opportunity simply presented itself. He brought her home, wrapped, hidden, silent. And in that moment, a terrifying realization hit him. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted possession. He wanted proof that he had beaten death itself. To him, the body wasn't evidence. It was a trophy. It wasn't enough to keep them. He needed a ritual. Every time he killed, he returned with something new. A token, a lock of hair, a piece of clothing, and then the body itself. He arranged them, organized them, numbered them. To anyone else, it would have looked like horror, but to him, it was art, his private gallery of death. Like any collection, one piece was never enough. The more he killed, the more he kept. And soon, the hidden space in his basement began to fill. Neighbors had no idea. They waved to him on the street. Some even joked about a strange smell. But nobody imagined the truth, that under their feet, death was piling up. Meanwhile, police were under fire. More people were disappearing. Families were demanding answers. Detectives worked night and day, mapping movements, interviewing witnesses, and comparing notes. For months, they found nothing. But slowly, pieces began to align. A car spotted near more than one scene. A man's name popping up in interviews. The beginnings of a pattern. But while police searched, he grew bolder. He bragged himself in journals. He photographed his collection. He even left clues, tiny hints, almost daring police to catch him. Because in his mind, he wasn't just a killer anymore. He was untouchable. He believed the police were chasing shadows, while he was building a legacy. But no one is untouchable forever. And the more he kept, the harder it became to control. The smell, the risk of discovery, the sheer number. One night, a neighbor heard something strange from his home. A thud, a sound that didn't belong. She told herself it was nothing, but that memory would come back later, and it would matter. By now, his collection had become his obsession, his trophies, his pride, his secret. But secrets like this never stay hidden forever. And soon, the very walls of his home would betray him. The police were closer than he ever imagined. And when they finally stepped inside, what they found would shock the world. It started with a noise complaint. A simple call. A neighbor had heard strange sounds again. Banging, dragging. And the smell, it was worse now. Police arrived thinking it would be routine. But nothing about this night would be routine. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, they tried the door. It creaked open. The house was dark. The air was heavy. And the smell hit them immediately. It wasn't the smell of garbage. It wasn't the smell of neglect. It was something worse. Something unmistakable. Death. The officers moved cautiously. Every creak of the floorboards echoed too loud. Upstairs, the rooms were messy but ordinary. Clothes piled up, dirty dishes, Nothing unusual, but the basement was locked, and the smell was strongest there. They called it in. Backup arrived. And soon, there were more boots on the floor, more lights in the darkness. Together, they forced a lock, and what they found would scar them forever. At first, it didn't look like much. Shapes covered in tarps. Boxes stacked against the wall. Old trunks. But as they pulled one tarp back, they froze. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't junk. It was a body. And then another. And another. One by one, the darkness gave up its secrets. The room was filled with them. The killer's trophies. The collection laid bare. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The air was too heavy. The reality too overwhelming. They had expected maybe one body. Maybe two. But this was something else. A slaughterhouse turned shrine. A graveyard hidden in plain sight. They called in crime scene units. Dozens of officers. Cameras. Evidence bags. Hour after hour, they documented everything. Each body had been wrapped, labeled, organized. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. The killer hadn't just killed. He had curated. He had built his collection carefully, piece by piece. And the deeper they searched, the clearer it became. This was years in the making. Then they found something else. A journal. Dozens of them. Page after page of writing. Every victim listed. Every detail recorded. To him, it was history. To police, it was a confession. One line stood out among the madness. They'll only know my greatness when they see my collection. By now, they knew what they had. Not just a killer. Not just a murderer. They had uncovered one of the largest hidden collections of bodies in modern history. News vans swarmed. Neighbors gathered outside. And whispers spread like wildfire. What was happening inside that house? The truth was worse than anyone imagined. The world was about to know. But while police uncovered the horror, the killer himself was somewhere else. And when he finally realized what had happened, that his collection was gone, that his secret was over, his reaction would shock even the most hardened detectives. Because in his twisted mind, the collection wasn't just evidence. It was his life. And losing it would push him over the edge. The news breaks. The discovery hit the news within hours. Headlines screamed across the nation. Bodies found in suburban home. Police uncover secret kill room. A collector of death exposed. But while the public reeled in horror, the killer wasn't at the house. He was somewhere else. And when the news reached him, his world began to collapse. Imagine it. You spent years creating something unspeakable. Every detail hidden, every piece preserved. And then suddenly, it's gone. For him, the collection wasn't just bodies. It was his identity. His proof of greatness. The moment he saw those flashing lights on television, the photos of bags being carried out of his basement, he knew they had found everything. His secret was dead. First came the denial. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they hadn't seen everything. Then came the anger. How dare they? How dare the world touch what was his? And finally, the fear, because he knew what came next. Police weren't just cleaning out a basement. They were hunting him. And they were close. For years, he'd been the predator. Stalking, watching, choosing his victims one by one. But now, he was prey. Police fanned out across the city. Every tip line was flooded. Every gas station attendant, every motel clerk, was told to watch for him. The walls were closing in. In the end, it wasn't brilliant detective work that caught him. It wasn't DNA. It wasn't technology. It was arrogance. Because even as the net closed in, he couldn't resist leaving a trace. He used his real name at a corner store, paid with a card he swore he'd never use again. And within hours, police had him surrounded. They stormed the motel just before dawn. Doors splintered. Shouts filled the hallway. And when they found him, he wasn't fighting. He wasn't running. He was sitting calmly on the edge of the bed, hands folded, almost waiting, like he knew this moment would come. In the interrogation room, detectives expected resistance. But what they got was something else. He talked, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but out of pride. Every question was answered with detail. Every victim described like an entry in a diary. It wasn't remorse. It was bragging. He wasn't confessing to crimes. He was boasting about achievements. At one point, a detective asked him, "Why? Why keep the bodies?" The killer leaned back, looked directly into the camera, and said, "Because memories fade, but collections last forever." It was a sentence that would haunt investigators for years. Because, in that moment, they finally understood. He never killed for necessity. He killed for permanence, for immortality. But even with his arrest, the nightmare wasn't over, because buried in his journals, scrawled between pages of horror, were references to more victims. Victims police hadn't found. Victims who may still be missing. The collection they uncovered might not have been complete. And the question that lingers to this day is simple. How many more?